couple of weeks ago, I was out visiting one of our small groups. They were out for a social, having dinner one night, so I stopped by to visit them. And one of the people that was there that night doesn't come to our church on Sunday mornings, and so I began to share with him about, or really just ask them, "Hey, do you guys have any questions about our church's campaign?" And so that person looked at me and said, "Hey, well, what kind of campaign is it?" And so I began to share about our campaign. I began to share with them briefly what we hope to accomplish, the money that we were trying to raise for that campaign. And so they responded, "Oh, so just a growth campaign, not a political campaign." And honestly, it caught me off guard because in thinking about our church and in thinking about our campaign and our mission and our vision and what we are trying to accomplish, I get so focused on our mission and vision and how that plays out for us that I can forget sometimes that for other people, they may connect a church with a political campaign. And certainly the timing of this campaign can really make that seem possible in someone's mind and definitely in that person's mind. But I assured them that that was not the case. We were doing a capital campaign. We were not doing a political campaign. I think I may even mention that, as a church, a political campaign wouldn't be something that we would engage in. I'm not sure if they appreciated that or not. They may have rather heard that there's a church doing a political campaign than a capital campaign. That can be more exciting for some people, I guess. But it's certainly a season where politics is weighing heavily on people's mind, and understandably so, because the future of our nation, much like the future of our church, is worth considering. We have an amazing country. We have the incredible fortune and responsibility of getting to play a part in helping to decide the people and the policies and the values that shape our country. And so when it comes to politics, it's important to spend time to figure out what you are for. And in politics, when you figure out what you are for in an election, you end up finding out who you are for, and then you get to cast your vote for them. And that's the amazing part of being a part of a democracy. Right? But for those of us that are Jesus followers, we have an additional responsibility, because while our country is in the middle of trying to figure out who the next president of our nation will be, Jesus followers, we already have a kingdom and we already have a king who is the ultimate authority in our lives. And his mission goes beyond political parties, it goes beyond national borders, and his mission really is to reach the entire world. And regardless of nationality, regardless of political party, Jesus isn't for your political party. He's not for your candidate. He is for all people. And as a follower of Jesus, and then certainly as a church, we must be for all people as well. We say this all the time. This is our mantra when it comes to being out and about in our community. We are for Thomasville and the surrounding areas, and we are for the people who live there because we believe that God is for those people. And as we kicked off this series a few weeks ago, we looked at the Great Commission where Jesus told us to go and make disciples of all nations. That's everyone. Jesus for all people. We don't get to pick and choose based off political affiliation or nationality or any other distinction, right? We need to be for all people. The message of Jesus was meant to be good news for all people, not just Republicans, not just Democrats, not just independents. And one thing I love about our church is that we are learning to sit in a room with people who have different beliefs than we do and be okay with that. There's a saying that I heard a lot growing up. You probably heard about this too. There's two things. The saying goes that there was two things that we don't talk about, right? It's religion and politics. Two things we don't talk about, religion and politics. And these are two very hot button issues that people can get pretty passionate about. But the thing is, people still talked about religion and politics, right? But they only talked it through with people who held their same views, people who shared their same values. It wasn't that you couldn't talk about religion and politics, it's that you just couldn't talk about religion and politics with anyone who disagreed with you. And what I think we've found is that over time, we've created generations of people who don't know how to have communication and don't know how to have conversations with each other if they can't see eye to eye with one another on these two issues. And while I know there's far much more to it than just that. I believe that the mentality behind this phrase is what part of what has led our country to be so divided. It's contributed to the division in our country because for decades we told people not to talk about something if you can't agree on it. And maybe instead we should have taught people how to disagree with integrity, how to disagree with integrity. And instead of teaching people how to diffuse or disarm a messy disagreement, we taught people just to barricade themselves in away from the enemy so that the conversation doesn't blow up in the first place. But as a church, we are learning to sit down with people who may believe differently than we do and not go to war with them over it. This is true politically and it's true spiritually for us as well. One of the things that we want to create in relationships is room to disagree. Room to disagree. Room to disagree politically, room to disagree in what we believe spiritually, and even room to disagree in how we practice those beliefs and still be able to get along, right? We think that we can be confident enough in what we believe, even if someone else believes something different. We don't have to find that to be a threat. Now, sure, there are some areas that we would consider essentials to the cores of the faith, what it means to be the core of a Christian, mostly around who Jesus is, what Jesus did, right? But we can still respect people who disagree with us on those things. And we actually want those people to show up to our church. We actually want those people to spend time with us because we think that church should be the safest place to ask questions about faith and the safest place to ask questions about life without having to be afraid of how you'll be treated if someone believes differently than you or has different values than you, right? We don't want people who have different values to feel like they're unwelcome here. In fact, we want them to feel like they are welcomed here. We want them to feel not judged in being here. And if we are doing this right, we will have people who believe differently than we do all of the time here at this church. If they believe differently about Jesus, if we're doing church right, they will still come, they will still hang out with us, and they will still hear about Jesus from us without feeling attacked. But if I'm honest, most arguments, most disagreements that Christians have are not with people outside of the faith. They're with people who are inside of the faith. They're more related to maybe how we interpret Scripture or more often how we practice our faith. And while I think it's perfectly reasonable and even healthy to have those distinctions, right? We certainly do as a church, the way that we interpret certain things, the way that we practice certain things. We have a few nuances that are different than other churches, right? All churches do, but that doesn't have to cause us to be divided. Again, there are certainly things worth holding the line for, but many things outside of the essentials, while we might disagree on them, they don't have to pull us apart. To borrow a phrase or a term from last week, we don't have to break fellowship with people. We don't have to let things pull us apart from one another. We can still pursue the same mission together. We just might approach it in different ways. And ultimately, and this can sound a little harsh, ultimately what you're saying, if your disagreement with someone causes you division or really causes you to break relationship with you altogether, what you're saying is that your opinion is more important than God's opinion. And I know that sounds harsh, right? But it moves you to the top of your world and it moves everybody else below you. And if you're not a Jesus follower, that is certainly an option in how you can choose to prioritize your life. But if you are a Jesus follower, that's not how Jesus lived, and that's not how Jesus called us to live. Jesus called us to love one another. He called us to serve one another. Jesus lived sacrificially. He put others' needs and interests ahead of his own. He calls us to do the same thing. It's easy to get along with people who believe like you, people who behave like you. That's not necessarily being loving. That's just being comfortable, right? Loving people who think differently than you and who act differently than you is much more challenging. It's much more demanding. But it's also much more rewarding. Listen to how Jesus talks about this idea of being together and loving people in John 15. He says, "As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands, and I remain in his love." Now, at first glance, it sounds like Jesus is suggesting that God's love is conditional. If we keep Jesus' commands, then God will love us, which implies that if we don't keep Jesus' commands, then God won't love us, which is confusing because if you're anything like me, growing up, I was told that God's love is unconditional. And the book of First John, John tells us that God himself is love. And the whole reason that God sent Jesus into the world was to demonstrate to the world how much God loves them. Not just the people that were already obeying God, not just the people that were already following God, but the mission and the message of Jesus was for everyone. And now it seems like Jesus is saying that only the people that obey him are loved by God. But this word remain, if you go back to Greek, which the New Testament was written in initially, the Greek word that they use for remain is meno. And this word meno, it can also mean to abide or to continue. And depending on how it's used, it can have a different context. So it can mean to remain in a physical place, to continue being present somewhere. It can be used in regards to time, to something that lasts or something that endures. But it can also be used to reference a state or a condition, to remain as one instead of becoming something different, to remain as one with something as opposed to becoming something different. And in that sense, it's as if Jesus is saying that our alignment with God and our alignment with his love is what he's talking about, more so than God's affection for us. Jesus is encouraging his followers to be aligned with the way that he loves others, the love that he demonstrated to them, the love that he demonstrated to us. And the commands that he talks about that he gave really serve as a guardrail to help us stay aligned in that type of love and on God's mission. And then one of the things that John likes to do when he talks is he highlights this idea of the connection of Jesus being a mediator between God and between man. And it's this idea that God sent Jesus to die on the cross to have a relationship with people so that people could have a relationship with God through Jesus. And so Jesus really is this essential piece that connects people to the Father, which is one of those core beliefs that I talked about that we have earlier. And Jesus echoes this same idea a couple chapters later in John 17, and what's known as the high priestly prayer as Jesus is praying for his disciples then, his followers then, but also he prays for everyone who would ever believe in him and eventually follow him. And here's what he talks about the importance of loving and of this unity between God, the Father, Jesus, and us. He says that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me, that they may be one, even as we are one, I and them and you and me, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them, even as you have loved me. Again, there's this idea as Jesus being the connection piece between God the Father and people of the world. God demonstrates his love to the world by sending Jesus. And then his followers, his disciples, people who follow today, continue to demonstrate that same love by remaining one with Jesus and remaining one with the Father, and then making that message known that Jesus came to die for other people and to love others, so that we would know that God sent Jesus. And if you go back to John 15, where we started, Jesus talks about what the result is if we remain in that love. He said, I have told you this so that my joy may be complete, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. So Jesus found his joy in demonstrating the love of the Father to the world. And if we are aligned in that same love, we can find that same joy, that we can find a complete joy based on love. Because let's be honest, just following this long list of rules and this long list of commands is not something that's really going to bring us joy. But if we align ourselves with the heart of the Father, with the love of the Father, if we align ourselves around that loving people, it's not hard to find joy in that. And then, in order to sort of make this idea clear between Jesus' commands and what he means to love people, he says this. He says, "My command is this: love each other as I have loved you." Jesus reduced all of his commands into just this one command: love each other as I have loved you. It's so much simpler, but it's so much more difficult, so much more demanding. It takes out all of the excuses because Jesus loved people who didn't love him back. Jesus loved people even when they disagreed with him. Jesus loved people when they didn't understand him. Jesus loved people who thought that he should have been doing it differently than the way he was doing it. And Jesus loved people even when it cost him. Jesus loved people sacrificially. And he tells us to love others that same way. And then he makes this next statement, which has become so familiar to us because we know the rest of the story, but I think it just sort of glanced over the disciples' heads at first. He says, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." So we hear these words spoken by Jesus, and we immediately think of what he did for us on the cross. We think of Jesus demonstrating his love by laying down his life for others so that they could have a relationship with God. And he gave himself as a sacrifice for others. And he says this right after saying that we are to love people the same way that he loves us. And at this point of the story, again, the disciples, this last part is just theoretical to them, right? They're thinking, sure, Jesus, yeah, love people the way that you've loved us. We can do that. That's not too hard. But they don't know the rest of the story. They don't know that in just a few chapters, Jesus would literally give his life for them, that he would be killed for their sake, that he would love them by dying for them. And we're supposed to love others the same way that Jesus loves us, right? Who wouldn't sign up for that? The disciples, they were absolutely all in. Jesus was being crucified. They were there at the foot of the cross, just like raising their hands, going, "Hey, me next." No, that's not what they did. They had all taken off. They had all deserted Jesus. They ran for their lives. They left Jesus to save themselves. But Jesus gave his life for them anyway. Jesus loved them anyway. What they eventually learned when Jesus rose back to life, when he gathered his followers back around him, the same followers that had deserted him. He says, "No, come on, we'll get back together." And he sends them out on his mission. What they learn is that laying down their life for other people, that loving other people the way that Jesus loved them can actually, for them, be better accomplished in the way that they lived instead of the way that they would die. And so they devoted the rest of their lives to the mission of making Jesus' love known to others. And so this week, as we wrap up our series, the question that I have for you today is this: what can you lay down for others? What can you lay down for others? And this can look a lot of different ways. There are so many different opportunities, so many different ways to demonstrate the love of God to other people, right? It could come in serving people in acts of kindness. It could come in some of the relationships that we build as we prioritize their needs and interests ahead of our own. It can come in taking the time to share the story of Jesus with someone, or maybe just sharing your personal story of how Jesus has worked in your own life with someone who needs to hear it. It could be praying for someone. It could be encouraging someone. It could be just listening to someone. Even if you don't know what to say back, they just want to know that someone is there. They just want to know that someone cares. And there's any number of ways to demonstrate the love of our Heavenly Father with people, to participate in his mission. And some of those will show up in your personal life. But other opportunities other opportunities will be a result of what we can do together.
A few years back, one family opened their living room to gather people together with the hopes of creating something new for Thomasville. It was clear that Thomasville didn't need just another church. It needed a different kind of church, a place where people could invite their friends who didn't even like church, a church where you can belong even before you believe, a church that is helpful and engaging. And the message of Jesus is good news for all people, not just church people. As momentum grew, core families pooled their resources with you in mind. And 5 years ago, Thomasville Church launched in an old storefront. We adapted to a space that didn't quite fit, overcame the challenges of COVID, and began to grow. We've been joined by people who are like-minded in our mission of inspiring people to follow Jesus. We've heard stories of people who were once disconnected from church and God, finally finding a place where they could feel at home. Then we found a new home as well. Thanks to the generosity of the Thomasville Music and Drama Troupe, we were able to purchase and renovate a permanent location. We've created spaces for our children and grandchildren to establish anchors in their faith. We've celebrated baptisms and seen lives transformed. We've gathered in small groups so people can connect in relationships, find support and encouragement, and grow in their faith. We've partnered with organizations that serve our community in food insecurity, foster care, child services, and more. We've volunteered at community events, and we've opened our doors to host the arts. And we've joined with our global network of partner churches to create these same experiences all over the world. But we haven't even started to scratch the surface of what we can accomplish together. We love Thomasville and the surrounding area. It's shopping and restaurants, it's recreation and community, it's nonprofits and schools. And more importantly, we love the people that those things represent. As we look to the future, there are challenges we need to overcome to continue to reach and serve our community well. We need to expand our staff and gathering spaces in order to better serve our growing number of adults and children. We need to create opportunities for students to explore a faith of their own. We need to build additional parking to pave the way for those who are yet to come. And we must stay committed to demonstrating to people who are far from God that God is not far from them. At one time, a group of people dreamed of what might be possible for your family and your faith, and they leveraged everything to make it possible. Now, it's our turn to continue what they started, to invest in what comes next, to invest in who comes next, to demonstrate for our community that together we are for Thomasville.